They thought she was just a quiet librarian who shushed people all day, until a veteran patron noticed the small scar on her wrist that only one unit in the world would recognize. What happened next didn't just change how he saw her, it revealed that sometimes the most dangerous people choose the quietest lives, and the most classified heroes hide behind library cards. The Millbrook Public Library had that particular silence that only comes from decades of whispered conversations and turning pages. Built in 1952 with red brick and tall windows, it sat on Maple Street like a guardian of forgotten stories. The morning light filtered through dust motes that danced above rows of carefully organized shelves, and the familiar scent of old paper and binding glue filled the air like incense in a church of knowledge. Sarah Mitchell moved through this sanctuary with practiced precision. At 48, she had the kind of face that people forgot immediately after meeting her. Pleasant but unremarkable, with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and reading glasses that perpetually hung from a chain around her neck. She wore cardigans in muted colors, sensible shoes that didn't make noise on the hardwood floors, and the patient expression of someone who had spent 10 years answering the same questions about overdue fines and printer malfunctions. She arrived every morning at 7:30 a.m., exactly 30 minutes before opening. The same routine every day. Unlock the front door, disable the alarm system, check the book return slot, and begin the methodical process of reshelving returned materials. She moved with economy of motion, never wasted energy, never seemed hurried despite always staying ahead of schedule. The regular patrons knew her as helpful, but reserved. She could locate any book in the system within minutes, recommend novels based on the smallest description, and mediate disputes between teenagers over computer time without raising her voice above a whisper. But nobody really knew Sarah Mitchell. They knew her function, her politeness, her reliability. They didn't know her story. Tuesday afternoon brought the usual mix of visitors. High school students claiming to research papers while actually scrolling social media. Elderly residents reading newspapers in the comfortable chairs by the periodical section. A young mother with twin toddlers exploring picture books with the determined chaos that only 2-year-olds can generate. And Frank Torres. Frank was 74, a Vietnam veteran who had been coming to the library twice a week for the past 3 years. He spent his time in the military history section, slowly working his way through memoirs and official accounts of conflicts he'd lived through and wars he'd missed. His weathered hands turned pages with reverence, and sometimes Sarah would notice him staring out the window with the 1,000-yard stare that never quite left men who had seen combat. Today, he was researching the Balkans conflict of the 1990s, surrounded by stacks of books about NATO operations and peacekeeping missions. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across his table as he made careful notes in handwriting that had been steady for 7 decades. "Excuse me, Mrs. Mitchell." Frank's voice carried the respectful tone he used for all women, a politeness learned in a different era. "Do you have anything about task force operations in Bosnia?" The official histories seemed to skip over certain details. Sarah looked up from the returns cart she had been organizing. "Let me check our military archives section. We have some declassified documents that might help." She walked toward the reference stacks with Frank following a few steps behind. The military history section occupied 2 full rows in the back corner of the library, far from the children's area and the general fiction that drew most visitors. Here, the books were older, many with library bindings that had been reinforced multiple times over decades of use. Sarah reached for a volume on the top shelf, standing on her toes to grasp it properly. The stretch caused her cardigan to ride up slightly, and her long-sleeved blouse beneath shifted just enough to reveal her left wrist. Frank stopped moving entirely. There, on the inside of her wrist, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small scar. Not a typical injury mark. This was precise, intentional. 3 small parallel lines with a 4th perpendicular mark. It looked like it might have been a manufacturing defect or an accident to most people. But Frank Torres had been briefed on identification marks 25 years ago, when he was still consulting for military intelligence despite his official retirement. He had seen this exact marking in a classified briefing about a joint operation that officially never happened. His breath cawed audibly. Sarah immediately noticed his change in demeanor. She pulled her sleeve down and turned to face him, her expression shifting from helpful librarian to something more alert, more watchful. "Is everything all right, Mr. Torres?" she asked quietly. Frank's mouth opened and closed twice before words came out. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with age. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "that mark on your wrist. I need to ask you something, and I apologize if I'm completely wrong, but did you serve with Task Force 141? The book Sarah had been holding slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet library. She didn't bend to pick it up. Instead, she stood very still, her eyes moving quickly to check that they were alone in this section of the building. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its warmth. It had become neutral, careful. Frank's training kicked in even after all these years. He recognized the response of someone who had been compromised and was assessing threats. He also recognized that this woman, this quiet librarian he'd been chatting with about book recommendations for months, had just shifted into a completely different mode of operation. "That scar," Frank continued gently, "it's not random. It's a field identification mark. 3 parallel cuts with a crosscut made with a combat knife. It was used by one unit only during one operation. Bosnia, 1999. Operation Silent Thunder." Sarah's face went completely pale. For 24 years, no one had recognized that mark. She had chosen this small town, this quiet job, specifically because it was the kind of place where no one asked questions about the past. "Please," she whispered, glancing toward the main area of the library where other patrons continued their research, oblivious to this conversation. "We can't discuss this here." "Ma'am, I'm not here to cause trouble," Frank said, his voice carrying the respect of one veteran addressing another. "But I need you to know, I lost people in that area, good people, and according to every official record I could access after leaving the service, Task Force 141 never existed." Sarah picked up the fallen book with movements that were too controlled, too precise. She wasn't moving like a librarian anymore. She was moving like someone who had been trained to remain calm under interrogation. "Mr. Torres," she said quietly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've never served in any military capacity." But as she said it, Frank noticed other things he had overlooked before. The way she positioned herself with her back never fully to an entrance, how her eyes automatically swept for exits whenever she entered a room. The fact that her reading glasses weren't prescription, he could see through them clearly when she bent over to help patrons with computer problems. "Ma'am," Frank said gently, "I don't know what happened over there, and I don't know why you're here now. But I want you to know that whatever you and your unit did, it mattered. There are families who got closure because of missions that never officially happened." Sarah's careful composure cracked for just a moment. Her hand involuntarily moved to her wrist, covering the scar. "How many people know about these marks?" she asked. "Very few," Frank admitted. "I only knew because I was intelligence liaison for Balkan operations. Most of the briefing materials were classified beyond my clearance level. But the identification protocols, those I was cleared to see." They stood in silence for a long moment, surrounded by books containing the official histories of conflicts that had been sanitized, edited, and approved for public consumption. None of these books would contain the story of Task Force 141 if such a unit had ever existed. "If I were to hypothetically confirm what you're asking," Sarah said carefully, "what would you do with that information?" Frank's answer came without hesitation. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Ma'am, I've kept secrets for 50 years. I can keep them for 50 more. Sarah studied his face with an intensity that seemed out of place in a library. She was reading him the way she might have once read a hostile situation, looking for tells, for deception, for danger. "Mr. Torres," she said finally, "what unit were you with in Vietnam?" 173rd Airborne. Later transferred to intelligence. "Why?" "Because," Sarah said, "before I answer any hypothetical questions, I need to know if you understand what silence really means." Frank nodded slowly. "Ma'am, there are operations I was involved with that my own wife never knew about. There are men I served with whose names I've never spoken aloud since coming home. I understand silence." Sarah looked toward the front of the library where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The building would close in 2 hours, and then she would drive home to her small apartment, heat up a frozen dinner, and spend another evening reading books about other people's adventures. "Hypothetically," she said quietly, "if such a unit had existed, and if such an operation had taken place, it would have been about extraction, getting people out who couldn't get out themselves." "Hostages?" Frank asked. "Journalists, aid workers, people who were in the wrong place when ethnic cleansing operations began, people whose governments couldn't officially acknowledge they were there." Frank's eyes widened. "How many, hypothetically?" 47 people over 18 months, all accounted for, all returned to families who had been told they were missing in action or killed. "Jesus," Frank breathed. 47 people. "Including," Sarah added, watching his face carefully, 3 American military advisors who were never supposed to be in that region." Frank's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and finally, something that looked like relief. "Thompson, Martinez, and Chen," he said quietly. Sarah's carefully maintained neutral expression flickered. "You knew them?" "Thompson was my nephew, my sister's boy. He was listed as killed in action during a training exercise in Germany. We buried an empty coffin." Frank's voice broke slightly. We never knew what really happened to him. Now it was Sarah's turn to look shaken. Tommy Thompson? Tall kid from Oregon? Always talking about his aunt's apple pie? That's him. Frank's eyes filled with tears. Is he? He's fine, Sarah said quickly. He's fine. He's married now, lives in Colorado, has twin daughters. He coaches Little League baseball. Frank sat down heavily in one of the reading chairs, his notebook falling forgotten to the floor. 24 years, he whispered. 24 years we thought he was dead. Sarah looked around again, confirming they were still alone. Then she sat down in the chair across from Frank, abandoning all pretense of being just a helpful librarian. Mr. Torres, Frank, what I'm about to tell you can never leave this room. Do you understand? He nodded, wiping his eyes. Task Force 141 was a joint operation. 6 people. We went in dark, with no official support, no backup, and no extraction plan. We were told it was a volunteer mission, that if we were captured or killed, our governments would deny we ever existed. Who were we? 2 Americans, 2 Canadians, 1 British operative, and 1 German intelligence officer. We had 48 hours to locate and extract civilians who had been taken during a raid on a refugee camp. Frank leaned forward. How did you find them? The same way you find anything in hostile territory, carefully. We spent 3 weeks gathering intelligence, mapping patrol routes, identifying safe houses. Then we went in. All 6 of you? All 6 of us. Sarah's voice carried the quiet pride of someone describing a job well done. We brought out 47 people over 3 separate extractions. No casualties. And then we disappeared. New identities, new lives, new countries in some cases. The operation was classified beyond black. It never happened. Frank processed this information slowly. So you came here, to Millbrook, to work in a library. I came here because it's quiet, because nobody asks questions about where you came from or what you did before. Because after spending 2 years planning ways to kill people efficiently, I wanted to spend time helping people learn things. Are the others safe? Happy as far as I know? We don't maintain contact. It's safer that way. Frank picked up his notebook, staring at the pages of research he'd been conducting. All this time, I've been reading about conflicts, trying to understand what happened to Tommy, and you've been here, helping me find books, listening to me talk about my nephew who I thought was dead. I remember Tommy, Sarah said softly. He was scared, but brave. He kept everyone's spirits up during the first extraction, made jokes even when we were being shot at. That sounds like him? Frank's voice was thick with emotion. Could you tell him that his family thinks about him, that we miss him? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Frank, Tommy thinks his family believes he's dead. He was told that's how it had to be, to protect his identity and yours. He doesn't know that you know the truth about what happened. Could you get a message to him? I could, but you need to understand the risks. If the wrong people found out that someone from his old life knows he survived, it could compromise not just him, but his wife and children. Frank nodded slowly. I understand, but maybe you could just let him know that his Uncle Frank is proud of him, that we all are. I can do that. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, surrounded by thousands of books containing the recorded histories of human conflict and triumph. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, and the library's automatic lights were beginning to flicker on. Mrs. Mitchell, Frank said finally, can I ask why you told me all this? You could have just maintained your cover. Sarah considered the question carefully. Because you asked the right questions, because you understood what silence means, and because, she paused, because sometimes carrying secrets alone gets heavy. How heavy? Heavy enough that I've spent 10 years in a job where the most dangerous thing that happens is occasionally having to ask teenagers to quiet down. Frank laughed despite himself. And now? Now you know. And that's either going to be a problem or it's going to be a relief. It's going to be a relief, Frank said firmly. Ma'am, I've been carrying my own secrets for decades. I know how to handle one more. As the library's closing announcement chimed softly through the building, Sarah stood and began collecting the books they had been discussing. She moved with renewed purpose, but also with something lighter in her step. Frank, she said, if you want to continue researching the Balkans conflict, I can recommend some sources that might give you a more complete picture. I'd like that. And if you ever want to know more about what really happened over there, we can have coffee sometime, away from here. Frank stood and extended his hand. Mrs. Mitchell, it's been an honor. As they shook hands, Sarah smiled for the first time since their conversation began. The honor was mine, Frank, in more ways than one. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the library at her usual time, unlocked the doors, and began her routine of organizing returned books. But as she worked, she found herself humming softly, something she hadn't done in years. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence. Sometimes heroes hide behind library cards. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right person asks the right question at exactly the right moment. Sarah Mitchell went back to being a quiet librarian, but she was no longer carrying her secrets alone.